The glass hit the wall so hard that people 3 tables over flinched. A woman sat rigid in her chair, trapped, cornered, her hands flat on the white tablecloth as if pressing them down was the only thing keeping her from shaking. 3 large men stood around her like walls. The man across from her smiled with the comfortable ease of someone who had never once been told no in a way that stuck. 60 people in that restaurant saw everything. 60 people looked away. One man set down his fork, looked at his 8-year-old daughter, and quietly asked her to move to another booth. Then he stood up. Oh, before we go any further, if you've never been to this channel before, you're in the right place. We tell stories that don't let go. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss what comes next, because trust me, this one only gets wilder from here. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and leave a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to that restaurant, because what happened next changed everything for everyone in that room. The reservation had been Mason's idea, which was already unusual. He wasn't a steakhouse kind of man. He wasn't particularly a restaurant kind of man, if he was being honest with himself. He was the type who made spaghetti on Tuesday nights and burnt the garlic bread and then ate it anyway because Ellie thought burnt garlic bread tasted better. And somewhere along the years he'd started to agree with her. He was the type who ate standing at the kitchen counter when she was at school because sitting alone at a table for 2 felt like a statement he didn't want to make. But Ellie was turning 8, and 8 felt significant in a way that snuck up on him. He'd been so focused on keeping her fed and enrolled and reasonably emotionally intact that he hadn't noticed how much of her had changed. Until one morning he looked up from his coffee and realized the little girl who used to demand he carry her to the car was now correcting his grammar. So he made a reservation at Carver's Grill on the north end of Fort Worth, which had linen napkins and a children's menu that Ellie would absolutely ignore in favor of ordering off the adult menu and eating exactly 4 bites of a $12 entree. He put on the least wrinkled shirt he owned. He let her wear the purple dress she'd been saving for a special occasion, even though the occasion had started at 4 p.m., and the dress had a sequined belt she kept spinning, and by 5:30 she'd already gotten water on the skirt. "Does it look bad?" she asked in the car. "Looks perfect," he said. "You're just saying that." "I'm saying it because it's true." She studied him from the passenger seat with those brown eyes that had been deciding whether or not to trust him since the day she was born. "You look nervous," she said. "I'm not nervous." "You drove past the parking lot." He had. He circled back without comment. The restaurant was the kind of place that made Mason vaguely uncomfortable in a way he couldn't fully articulate. Low lighting, heavy wood paneling, people dressed like they'd come from something or were heading somewhere. He'd spent a significant portion of his adult life in environments where discomfort was a survival signal, and he'd learned to parse it. This wasn't danger. This was just a man from a small house in a working-class neighborhood sitting in a booth that cost more per square foot than his kitchen. He ordered a ribeye. Ellie ordered the salmon, asked the waiter 3 questions about it, and then ate the breadbasket instead. They talked about her friend Cora's hamster, which had recently escaped and been found inside a sneaker. They talked about multiplication tables, which Ellie found insulting. They talked about whether a hot dog was technically a sandwich, a debate she'd apparently been having at recess for 2 weeks. Mason wasn't much of a talker, generally. He had a way of listening that some people read as coldness, and that Ellie had somehow always understood was just how he was built. She'd always talked enough for both of them, which he suspected was partly her personality and partly some unconscious awareness that silence made him comfortable in ways it didn't make other people. He was watching her attempt to calculate whether she could finish a 3rd roll without ruining her appetite. She couldn't, but she would anyway, when the sound hit. Not a crash, a crack. The specific sharp report of glass impacting a solid wall at high velocity, close enough that the couple at the next table both startled, and a woman near the back actually stood up from her chair. Mason didn't startle. He was already turning. Across the restaurant, maybe 40 feet and 2 rows of tables away, a man was standing. He was around 60, with the kind of build that had once been substantial and now just looked dense. Thick through the shoulders, expensive suit, silver hair swept back in a way that required effort and probably product. His face was the face of a man who had spent decades watching other people accommodate him, and the accommodation had become invisible to him the way water becomes invisible to things that live in it. His expression wasn't angry. That was the thing Mason clocked first. He wasn't red-faced or shouting. He was calm in a way that was actually worse, because it meant the broken glass had been deliberate and measured, not an accident, and not even a loss of control. A woman sat across from him. She was younger, late 20s, maybe 30, with dark hair pulled back, a jacket that said she'd come from something professional, and hands flat on the tablecloth in front of her. Her posture was rigid, not the rigidity of anger, the rigidity of someone trying to hold themselves together, while their mind worked through options and found most of them closed. 3 men stood around the table. 2 flanked the woman's side. 1 stood slightly behind the silver-haired man like a piece of furniture that happened to be able to break things. They were dressed well enough to pass, dark suits, no obvious weapons that Mason could see from where he sat. But they weren't guests. The way they occupied space was different. They were placed. The silver-haired man said something Mason couldn't hear from the distance. He leaned forward, one hand on the table, and the woman looked at whatever he'd pushed toward her. Papers, it looked like, some kind of document, and said something back that made the man's jaw tighten, almost imperceptibly. Nobody in the restaurant was moving. That part Mason noticed because he noticed things like that. 60-some people in a room, servers included, and the collective decision had been to become very interested in their plates. He didn't entirely judge it. Most people aren't built for confrontation, and most confrontations resolve themselves without anyone's help. And getting involved in a stranger's business in a restaurant is a complicated calculation that most people reasonably fail. He looked at Ellie. She was watching the table across the room with the wide, unguarded attention of a child who hadn't yet learned to pretend she wasn't watching. Her third roll was frozen halfway to her mouth. "Hey," he said. She looked at him. "I need you to move to that booth." He nodded toward the booth nearest the kitchen, further from the disturbance, where a server station partially blocked the sight line. "Take your plate." She didn't argue, which told him she was more unsettled than she was letting on. She picked up her plate and her water glass and her roll, in that order, and slid out of the booth. "Stay there," he said. "Okay, Dad." "I mean it. Don't move toward me. Don't come back here. Just stay." "I know what stay means," she said quietly, and went. He watched her settle into the other booth. A server materialized immediately, bless her, and started talking to Ellie like a person, which was all Ellie needed to stop looking back at him. Mason got up. He didn't move fast. Fast draws attention, disrupts rooms, communicates urgency to everyone watching, and sometimes urgency makes things escalate. He walked toward the table at the pace of a man who was heading somewhere with a clear and untroubled purpose. He kept his hands visible and relaxed. He kept his face neutral. The silver-haired man saw him coming when he was about 15 feet out and tracked him with the flat assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating threat levels in social situations. Mason reached the edge of the table. The woman looked up at him. Up close, she was sharper than she'd looked from across the room. Composed, watchful, the kind of person who noticed things quickly and filed them away. Her eyes went to his face, then to the men around her, then back to his face. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Mason said to her. He kept his voice even and conversational, like he was asking about the soup. "Are you all right?" The silver-haired man spoke before she could. "This is a private conversation, friend." "I wasn't talking to you," Mason said pleasantly. A beat. The man's expression shifted by a fraction. Not quite surprise, but a recalibration. The woman said carefully, "I'm fine. Thank you." She wasn't fine. He could see it in the tension across her collarbone, the careful measurement of every word. But she was also thinking, which meant she wasn't gone. "You want to leave?" Mason asked. She held his gaze for a moment. Something moved behind her eyes. "Yes," she said. "I do." Mason nodded. He looked at the silver-haired man without particular hostility. "Then she's leaving." "She has a business matter to finish," the man said. "Looks finished to me." The man leaned back in his chair and did the thing that powerful men do when they're recalibrating. That slight smile, that reassessment, that subtle shift from dismissal to something more interested. "Son, I don't think you understand what you're walking into." "Probably not," Mason agreed. "She's still leaving." The woman started to push back her chair. The bodyguard on her left moved first. Not a strike, a grab. His hand came down on her forearm with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done it before, and the woman went still with the particular stillness of someone who'd been grabbed before and had learned that going still was safer than fighting. Something changed in Mason. He couldn't have explained it clearly if asked, and he'd thought about it since, in the way you think about things that happen faster than conscious thought. It wasn't a decision exactly. It was more like a door that had been closed for 8 years, cracking open just far enough to let something through. He looked at the bodyguard. He didn't say anything. He didn't move toward the man. He just looked at him. Later, the woman would try to describe it to someone and struggle, because there wasn't a clean word for it. It wasn't aggression in any way she could point to. No raised voice, no squared shoulders, no visible threat. It was something quieter and considerably worse. It was the look of a man who was not afraid of what happened next, in a way that made immediately clear he was one of the very few people in the room about whom that was genuinely true. The bodyguard let go of her arm. The other two men did not move toward Mason. They looked at each other instead. The quick involuntary glance of people who have just shared an uncomfortable realization and are hoping the other person has a solution. They didn't. Mason extended his hand to the woman. She took it and stood. He kept himself positioned between her and the table as she steadied herself. Her heels, the physical shock of the moment, whatever combination of things had her slightly unsteady, and then he moved with her toward the front of the restaurant. Behind them, the silver-haired man's voice followed them across the room, measured and deliberate, calibrated to carry. "Mr. Calloway?" Mason slowed. He knew what the man was doing, using his name, proving he knew it, proving he'd already looked. "You've made a very powerful enemy tonight," the man said. "I want you to understand that clearly." Mason turned back, just far enough to meet the man's eyes across the distance of the restaurant. "I've had worse," he said. He turned around and walked out. The night air on the sidewalk outside Carver's Grill was cooler than the restaurant had been, and it hit the woman. Audrey, she'd tell him later. Audrey Langford, like something she hadn't known she was waiting for. She stood next to Mason on the sidewalk and breathed for a moment with her eyes closed. He didn't rush her. When she opened her eyes, she said, "I don't know who you are." "Mason Calloway," he said. "I'm a mechanic." She looked at him, really looked at him. The kind of look that was taking stock, doing math. "That's not entirely true, is it?" He didn't answer. "The man in there," she said. "He used your name." "He did? How did he know it?" "I don't know yet." She nodded slowly, like she was filing that away alongside everything else. Then she said, "My car's in the garage on the corner. I'm fine. I just need a minute." "Okay. You should go back to your dinner." "I will." He paused. "My daughter's in there." Something crossed her face. Not pity, something more complicated. "How old?" "8 today?" Audrey Langford looked at him for another moment. "Happy birthday to her," she said softly. He went back inside. Ellie was eating her third roll at the server station booth and telling the server, a 20-something woman named Danny, as far as Mason could tell, an extremely detailed account of the hamster and the sneaker incident. She looked up when he slid back into the booth across from her, assessed him the way she always assessed him, and apparently decided he passed. "Is she okay?" Ellie asked. "She's okay." "Those men were being mean to her." "Yeah." "You didn't hit anyone." "No." She considered this. "How come?" Mason picked up his fork. "Didn't need to." Ellie thought about that for a moment, the way she thought about things, turning them over, testing them for structural integrity. That's actually cooler, she decided, and went back to her roll. He watched her eat, and the thing he felt wasn't pride exactly, though it was close to that. It was something quieter. The particular relief of a man who has spent years afraid that what he used to be was going to find its way back into the life he'd built, and who had just confirmed that it could come back, briefly, exactly as needed, and then leave again. He thought about the silver-haired man's voice. "You've made a very powerful enemy tonight." He thought about his own name in a stranger's mouth. He thought about the look on the bodyguard's face when he let go of Audrey Langford's arm. He ate his steak. The night wasn't over. He understood that with a clarity that had nothing to do with intuition and everything to do with experience. Some things, once set in motion, don't stop. But right now, Ellie was telling him about the time Cora's hamster had apparently also gotten into a bag of pretzels, which was a sequel to the sneaker story he hadn't known existed. He listened. He came home every night. That was the deal he'd made with himself 8 years ago, and the only one that had never broken. Whatever Vincent Crowe intended to do next, that part wasn't going to change. She found him at 7:14 in the morning. Mason knew the exact time because he just put Ellie's lunch bag into her backpack. Turkey sandwich, apple slices, one of those small bags of pretzels she'd been obsessed with since October, and was zipping it shut when the knock came. Not the doorbell. A knock 3 times, spaced like someone who was uncertain whether they had the right address but had decided to commit anyway. He looked through the peephole first. Old habit, non-negotiable. Audrey Langford was standing on his porch in a gray blazer and dark slacks, her hair down now instead of pulled back like it had been the night before. She looked like she hadn't slept particularly well. She was holding a paper coffee cup from somewhere, which she seemed to have forgotten about until he opened the door, at which point she looked down at it like she was mildly surprised it was still there. "I know this is early," she said. "It's fine." He stepped back. "Come in." She came in and immediately did what people always did in his house, which was try not to visibly react to the fact that it was very small and very clean, and contained almost no decoration whatsoever except for a row of Ellie's drawings taped along the hallway wall and a single framed photograph on the shelf above the television. Mason and Ellie at some lake somewhere, both of them squinting into the sun, neither one of them quite smiling, but both of them clearly okay. Audrey looked at the photograph for a second and then looked away because she was polite. "Who's watching my house?" Mason asked. She looked at him. "Excuse me?" "Someone told you where I live. Either you hired someone to find me last night, or you had someone already watching and they made the call when you came out of the restaurant." He wasn't accusatory about it. He was just working the problem. "Which one?" A pause. She was recalibrating. He could see it. She'd come prepared for a certain kind of conversation, and he'd just skipped about 4 steps of it. "The second one," she said. "I have a security consultant. When I knew I was meeting Crow last night, he ran backgrounds on everyone in the restaurant who had a reservation. Routine precaution. And your file came back mostly empty, which he said was unusual. Most people have more." She set her coffee cup on the counter and faced him squarely, which he respected. "Your military record is sealed. He couldn't get the details, but the outline was there. Years of service, classified deployments, early separation with full honors." She paused. "Special operations." Mason said nothing. "I'm not here to push on that," she said. "I'm here because I need help, and you're apparently the most qualified person I've accidentally met." From this hallway. "Dad, I can't find my other shoe." Mason turned. "Check under your bed." "I did." "Check again." A pause. Then, with the specific resignation of a child who has been right before, "Oh, okay." Audrey watched the hallway for a moment. Something in her expression shifted slightly, though she controlled it fast. Mason crossed to the coffee maker and poured himself a cup he hadn't gotten to yet. He didn't offer her one because she already had one. "Tell me what's actually happening," he said. "Not the version where you ease into it." She appreciated that. He could tell. She took a breath and started. Langford Defense Systems had been her father's company for 30 years. He'd built it from a mid-sized defense electronics firm into one of the primary providers of guidance and targeting systems for the U.S. military. When he died 2 years ago, sudden cardiac event, 64 years old, no warning, Audrey had inherited the company, the board, and a federal contract worth approximately $1.2 billion over 7 years that was currently in its 3rd year and running into problems she hadn't initially been able to explain. The problems weren't operational. Her engineering teams were solid, the systems were performing, but somewhere between the finished product and the delivery documentation, things were going wrong. Specifications were being questioned, components were failing validation tests they should have passed without difficulty. And the government contract officer assigned to the deal had begun sending communications that strongly suggested he was hearing things, specific technical things, that he should only be hearing from inside Langford's own development division. "Someone's talking," Mason said. "Someone's leaking," Audrey said. "There's a difference. Talking suggests accidents. This is deliberate. Whoever it is has been feeding technical details to someone who's using them to make our work look unreliable. Our validation failures started the same month Crow first approached me about acquiring the company." She let that land. "He made an offer last spring, below market but not embarrassingly so. I declined. He made another offer in the fall. I declined again. 3 weeks ago, I found out that 2 of my board members had been in private meetings with him that I wasn't told about." Ellie appeared in the kitchen doorway with her backpack half on and her left shoe finally located. She looked at Audrey with the uncomplicated assessment of an 8-year-old, which involved no pretense whatsoever. "Hi," Ellie said. "Hi," Audrey said. "I'm Audrey." "I know. You were at the restaurant." A beat. "I was," Audrey said. Ellie looked at her father. "Is she okay now?" "She's okay," Mason said. "Good." Ellie accepted this and turned back to her backpack zipper, which was catching on something. "Dad, your friend from the restaurant is at our house very early. I noticed. Are you going to be late to work?" "No?" She got the zipper. She adjusted the backpack straps, which she always did wrong on the right side, and Mason crossed the kitchen without thinking about it and fixed the strap while she held still and let him. It was this kind of small practice transaction that exists in every household between parents and children and accumulates into something that has no name but is perhaps the most load-bearing thing in either of their lives. "Bus in 8 minutes," he said. "I know." She grabbed her lunch bag from the counter and then, because she had apparently decided Audrey warranted it, said, "Nice to meet you." "Nice to meet you too," Audrey said. And then Ellie was out the front door and the house was quieter, and Mason turned back to Audrey and said, "Keep going." She told him about the meeting the night before. Not a dinner, not anything social. Crow had requested a meeting through intermediaries framed as a final conversation before he escalated to the board. She'd agreed to attend because her attorney had advised her that refusing could complicate things legally. She'd brought nothing to sign. She hadn't anticipated him bringing his own documents or that the conversation would deteriorate the way it did. "He knows things he shouldn't know," she said. "Specific things. Project names. Internal memos. Timeline delays that we never made public." She paused. "He knew about a communication I sent to my lead engineer last month that only 3 other people should have seen." "So the leak is close," Mason said. "Very close." He refilled his coffee. Not because he needed more coffee, but because it gave him something to do while he thought, and he thought better when his hands were occupied. "What do you want from me?" She'd prepared for this question. He could tell by the way she answered it. Clear, direct, no softening. "I want you to come into Langford Defense and find the leak. I need someone who can operate quietly, who Crow won't recognize or connect to me, who can look at what's happening from the inside without triggering whoever's responsible to disappear." She looked at him steadily. "I'm offering you a consulting contract, building systems review. You'd come in as a contractor, completely routine, nobody looks twice. And when I find what you're looking for, we take it to federal investigators with a package they can't ignore." Mason set down his cup. "I have a job." "I know. I have a daughter who needs her father to come home." "I know that too." "What you're describing isn't safe. If Crow is willing to do what he did in that restaurant, in public, with 60 witnesses, he's not worried about consequences. That means he has either enough money or enough leverage to feel protected, probably both." He looked at her. "Getting near something like that has a cost. Sometimes the cost follows you home." Audrey held his gaze. "I understand that." "I don't think you fully do," he said, not unkindly. "But I appreciate that you're trying." He told her he needed to think about it. She gave him her card, actual physical card, which he noticed, and told him she'd wait for his call. He walked her to the door and she went, and he stood in the kitchen for a while with his coffee and the quiet that Ellie always left behind her when she went to school, which was a specific kind of quiet that never quite felt empty. He thought about Crow. He thought about the way the man had used his name. Mr. Calloway. Easy and deliberate, like dropping a coin on a table to see how the other person flinched. He thought about the bodyguard letting go of Audrey's arm. He thought about whether a man like Crow, told no by a mechanic from a small house on the north side of Fort Worth, would consider that the end of the conversation. He was fairly sure he already knew the answer. He went to work. He spent that day and the next in a routine that had the particular comfort of things that don't require much thought. Diagnostic work on a pair of industrial compressors that a manufacturing plant near the stockyards had been nursing along for 2 years past their service life. It was straightforward, physical, the kind of work that let his mind run in the background on other things. He ate lunch in his truck. He picked Ellie up from after-school care at 5:30. He made dinner. Real dinner, chicken and vegetables, not frozen anything, because her pediatrician had mentioned iron levels, and he'd taken it more seriously than she probably intended. She told him about her day with the same compressed completeness she always brought to these recaps. Cora got in trouble for talking during math. Miss Portman moved her seat to next to Eddie, which Cora says is even worse. I got 100 on my spelling test. There's a field trip in 2 weeks I need the permission form signed for. Where to? The Science Museum. They have an exhibit about bridges. It's going to be cool. It will be, he agreed. Will you sign it tonight? You always forget, and then it's the day of, and you do it in the car. That happened once. It happened 3 times. He signed the form after dinner. He was washing dishes when his phone rang. Unknown number, which he usually ignored. He picked it up because of the last 2 days. Mr. Calloway, said a voice he didn't recognize. Male, flat affect, businesslike in the way that people are when they're reading from a script they've internalized enough to sound natural. This is a courtesy call. Mr. Crow wanted you to know that he doesn't hold any hard feelings about the other night. He's a practical man. He understands that you saw a situation and made a decision. He respects that. Mason dried his hands on the dish towel. That's very generous. He'd like to have a conversation with you. Just a conversation. He thinks you're a man who appreciates a direct approach. He's not wrong about that. He's free tomorrow afternoon. I'm not, Mason said. Tell him thanks for the call. He hung up. He stood in the kitchen for a moment. The dishwater was getting cold. He drained it. That was Monday. On Thursday, his phone rang again. Not an unknown number, this time. The elementary school's main office number. He picked up before the second ring. Mr. Calloway, this is Linda Ferris. I'm the office manager at Ridgecrest Elementary. I'm sorry to bother you at work. I wanted you to know that Ellie is fine. She's perfectly fine. He was already walking to his truck. What happened? Nothing happened. Ellie is safe. She's in my office right now. But this morning, during recess, a man approached the fence near the playground. A pause. He spoke to one of the supervisors. He said he was looking for the Calloway girl. He knew her name. He knew yours. The supervisor asked him to leave, and he did, but she flagged it for me immediately. Mason was in his truck. He was calculating time and distance. I'm on my way. Like I said, Ellie is completely, tell her I'm coming. Don't let her outside for any reason until I get there. Nobody takes her anywhere, not to any room in the building, unless it's a lockdown situation and you're following protocol. You understand? A beat. Linda Ferris was recalibrating the way people did when someone changed registers on them. Yes. Yes, of course. I'll be there in 12 minutes. He was there in 9. Ellie was sitting in the office on the padded bench next to Linda's desk, eating a granola bar someone had given her and reading a library book with the particular composure of a child who had decided to treat this as an adventure rather than something frightening. She looked up when he came through the door, and her face did the thing it always did. Not a full expression, just a micro-shift, a settling, the particular relaxation of someone for whom a specific person entering a room means the room is now safe. Hi, she said. Hi. He sat next to her. He looked her over, not obviously, the way he'd trained himself not to be obvious about it. Shoes, hands, jacket, face, fine, all fine. You good? I'm fine. Linda gave me a granola bar. I see that. It's the oats and honey kind. The good one. He looked at Linda Ferris across the desk. She was maybe 55, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, the kind of person who had clearly handled every variety of school crisis for a long time, and who was watching him now with a particular careful attention. Tell me exactly what the supervisor observed, Mason said. Linda described it carefully. Male, approximately 40 to 45, business casual clothes, nothing alarming on its own. He'd come to the fence near the east playground during morning recess, approximately 10:15. He'd spoken to the recess supervisor on duty and asked which of the kids was the Calloway girl. When the supervisor asked why he was asking, he'd said he was a family friend, that he had a message for her father. The supervisor told him that wasn't something she could help with. He accepted this without argument, thanked her politely, and left. Before he left, Linda added, he said one more thing to the supervisor. He said, tell her father that Mr. Crow knows where she goes to school, and that he hopes they have a wonderful day. The room was quiet for a moment. Mason looked at Ellie, who was reading her book and giving every indication of not tracking the conversation, which he didn't entirely believe. Ellie, he said, Did anyone talk to you today? Anyone you didn't know? She looked up. No, Linda already asked me that. I'm asking again. She thought about it with appropriate seriousness. No, some kid I don't really know said my shoes were cool, but I know who he is. He's in third grade. Okay. Why? What's happening? He looked at her for a moment. She was 8. She was smart enough that lying to her was pointless and young enough that the full truth was inappropriate, and he had to find the space between those two things in about 3 seconds. Someone I know made a poor decision, he said. I'm handling it. You don't need to worry about anything, but I need you to stay with Linda for a little while longer while I make some calls. Can you do that? She studied him the way she always studied him. Are we in trouble? No, he said. It wasn't entirely true, and she probably knew it wasn't entirely true, but he said it with enough steadiness that she let it stand. Okay, she said, and went back to her book. He stepped out into the hallway and called Audrey Langford. She picked up on the second ring. Mason. Someone went to my daughter's school this morning, he said. Crow sent a message. He knows where she goes. He wanted me to know he knows. A silence on the other end that had weight to it. Are you accepting my offer? She said. It wasn't quite a question. With conditions, he said. Name them. I come in as a contractor, like you said. Building systems consultant, nobody looks twice. I'll need access to common areas, server infrastructure locations, any space accessible to general staff. I'll need a direct line to you only. Nobody else at Langford knows what I'm actually doing. And I will not be your bodyguard. I will not stand next to you in meetings or escort you to your car. That's not what this is. Understood. And Ellie doesn't know anything beyond the fact that I changed jobs for a while. Of course. He was quiet for a second. Down the hall, through the glass panel of Linda's office door, he could see Ellie sitting with her granola bar and her book, turning a page with the careful deliberateness of someone who was definitely not listening to her father through a glass door. She absolutely was listening. One more thing, he said. Yes. Crow sent a message by threatening my daughter. I'm not interested in matched escalation. I'm not going to threaten his family or his employees or anyone who isn't directly responsible for what's happening. You need to know that about me going in. I'll find who's feeding him information. I'll build a case that destroys him legally. And that's where it ends. If at any point you decide you want something else from this, I don't, Audrey said. That's exactly what I want. He nodded to himself. I'll start Monday. He arranged for Ellie's friend Cora's mother, a woman named Diane, whom he'd spoken to maybe 12 times in 2 years, but who had always struck him as capable, to handle school pickup for the next 2 weeks, citing a work conflict. Diane agreed without difficulty. He didn't explain further. He drove Ellie home and made dinner and helped with the field trip permission form follow-up, which involved her reorganizing her backpack in a way that made perfect sense to her, and none whatsoever to him. And they watched 40 minutes of a nature documentary about ocean animals before she fell asleep on the couch, and he carried her to bed. He sat in the kitchen afterward and thought about what he was walking into. 8 years. 8 years of not being what he used to be, of building something that looked from the outside like an ordinary life and felt from the inside like exactly what it was, the most demanding thing he'd ever chosen. Harder than deployments, harder than anything he'd done in any country whose name he still didn't say out loud. Because at least on those missions there had been a clear structure, objectives, protocols, exit strategies. Fatherhood had none of those things. Fatherhood was just showing up, imperfectly, day after day, and hoping the cumulative effect of showing up outweighed the cumulative effect of everything you did wrong. He didn't have nightmares anymore. That had taken years and hadn't been a clean or linear process, and there were still occasional nights where he woke up with his pulse wrong and had to sit on the edge of the bed in the dark for a while. But mostly he slept. Mostly he was fine. He thought about the man at the fence. He knew where she goes to school. Mason went to bed at 11. He set his alarm for 5:30. He lay in the dark and felt the particular quality of anger that had no heat in it. Not the hot kind, not the reactive kind, but the cold and patient kind that was considerably more dangerous, and that he had for 8 years not had occasion to feel. He felt it now. He let himself feel it, acknowledged it, and then set it carefully aside in the way a man sets aside a tool he's going to need later but doesn't want to carry around in his hands all day. Monday came. He wore a shirt that said Apex Facilities Group on the left chest, a contracting company that existed in Texas state business records, and had a website and a phone number that went to an answering service. Audrey had set it up over the weekend with legal assistance. He had a badge and a work order and a toolbox that was real and functional because the cover worked better when the work was real. Nobody at Langford Defense Systems looked at him twice. He was a contractor. Contractors were invisible in office buildings in the same way service workers were invisible in restaurants, not because people were deliberately dismissive, but because the background of any functioning environment includes people who maintain it, and the people who maintain it have learned to move like they belong without requiring acknowledgement. He spent the first 2 days doing exactly what his work order said, checking air handling units, reviewing building automation system logs, mapping utility access points. The building was a 6-story glass and steel structure in the West Park Business District, about 4,000 employees between the main tower and 2 adjacent buildings. He worked methodically, room to room, floor by floor, and while he worked, he cataloged everything else. Who moved where and when, which corridors were quiet at which hours, where the cameras were and where they weren't, which employees badged in before 8 and which stayed past 6, who ate lunch at their desks and who left the building. On the second day, he found the server room that shouldn't have been active. It was on the building's 4th floor, sub-corridor behind a fire exit stairwell, a space that appeared on his building schematics as a decommissioned telecommunications closet from an earlier renovation. According to the facility's records he'd been given access to, it had been cleared out 18 months ago. But the door had a newer card reader than the rest of the corridor, and when Mason put his hand against the wall next to it on a cold Tuesday morning, he felt the faint warmth of active equipment on the other side. He marked it on his clipboard like he was noting a ventilation issue and kept walking. He called Audrey that night from his truck in the parking lot of a grocery store because he'd learned a long time ago not to make certain phone calls from home. There's an active server room on the 4th floor that isn't in any of your current IT asset records, he said. Who has the final sign-off on facility access changes? A pause. Building operations. Which reports to our facilities director? Who reports to... She stopped. Who reports to whom? He said. To Damian Holt, she said. My head of security. Silence between them. How long has Damian worked for you? Mason asked. 4 years. He came highly recommended. My father hired him. Another pause, and he could hear something shifting in her voice. Not panic, but the particular sound of a person recalculating a significant portion of their recent past. Mason. Don't change anything, he said. Don't treat him differently. Don't avoid him. Don't watch him more than usual. He can't know anything's changed. How am I supposed to? You're the CEO of a defense company, he said. You already know how to keep things off your face. Do that. A longer pause. Okay, she said. He went home. He checked the door lock twice, which he didn't normally do. He looked in on Ellie, who was asleep with 3 stuffed animals arranged in a very specific configuration that he'd been told not to disturb under any circumstances. He went to bed. The week that followed was the kind of slow, methodical work that most people pictured as exciting, and that was actually just exhausting. Staying alert in plain sight, trusting peripheral vision, keeping track of patterns that only became patterns across multiple days of observation. He found the rhythm of the building. He learned which IT employees stayed late and which ones always left by 5. He learned that the 4th floor subcorridor was accessed by badge approximately 3 times a week, always between 11:30 p.m. and 2 a.m., and always by a single badge registered to a name he hadn't expected. Rachel Kim. 28 years old, IT security specialist, 4 years at Langford, consistently excellent performance reviews. The kind of employee who went unnoticed because she was reliable. He decided to wait inside. On a Thursday night, he told Diane he had a late work obligation, thanked her for watching Ellie, and was in position inside the decommissioned server room by 10 p.m. He'd gotten in through a maintenance access panel, which had required some patience and a flathead screwdriver. He sat in the dark between 2 equipment racks and waited. At 12:47, the card reader beeped. Rachel Kim came in alone. She was wearing a gray hoodie over work clothes, like she'd intended to leave and come back. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had done this enough times to stop looking over her shoulder, which Mason took note of because it meant either confidence or exhaustion or both. She pulled a laptop from a bag, connected it to one of the rack units, and started working. Fast. Practiced. Her hands didn't shake. Mason stayed where he was and watched. In the pale light of her screen, he could see her face clearly enough. She wasn't enjoying this. That was the thing he noticed first, and that mattered most. The particular expression of someone who is doing something they've decided to do, despite what they feel about it. Not indifference. Not contempt. Something more miserable than either. He waited until she'd copied what she came for and was packing up to leave. Then he turned on his flashlight and said quietly, from between the racks, "Don't run. I'm not going to arrest you, and I'm not going to hurt you, but I need you to talk to me." She ran anyway. He caught up with her in the hallway, not by being faster, she was fast, but by cutting off the exit she was heading for. He positioned himself between her and the stairwell door and held up both hands, flashlight pointing at the floor, the universal signal for "I am not attacking you, please stop for 1 second." She stopped. She was breathing hard and her back was against the wall, and she was looking at him with the kind of fear that had context behind it. Not just the fear of being caught, but something older and heavier. "Who are you?" she said. "I work for Audrey Langford." "You're a facilities contractor." "That's one thing I am," he said. "Rachel, I've been watching this room for a week. I know you've been in here 3 times. I know what's on those servers." He paused. "I also know you haven't slept properly in months. I can see it." She stared at him. "I'm not here to build a case against you," he said. "I'm here to understand what's actually happening. Those are 2 different conversations." She was quiet for a long moment. In the dim hallway, with the server room light still leaking under the door behind them, she looked much younger than her file. "If I talk to you," she said slowly, "and Crow finds out—" "Crow's already using you," Mason said. "He has been since before this started. Whatever he told you about what he'd do if you cooperated with someone. He told you that because cooperation is what he's afraid of, not because you don't have options." Another silence. She was working through something. He could see the calculation happening. "My sister," she said finally. "She's been in the country for 3 years. Her visa status is— It's complicated. Crow has people who can make it very uncomplicated, in the wrong direction." She pressed the back of her head against the wall. "He showed me documentation. He has contacts at the agency level. 1 phone call, and she gets flagged for removal." Mason had heard this particular story in different shapes before. Leverage that found the thing a person couldn't afford to lose and pressed until the person stopped being a person and started being a tool. It was effective because it worked on the best instincts, not the worst ones. Rachel Kim wasn't here at midnight stealing classified files because she was disloyal or greedy. She was here because someone she loved was in a country she'd brought her to, and the cost of saying no was too high. "I can help your sister," he said. "Not a promise I'm making lightly. I can put you in contact with people who can look at her situation with eyes that Crow doesn't own." She looked at him for a long time. "What do you need from me?" she said. "Tell me everything he's asked for, every file, every timeline, every name he's used as a go-between. And when I'm ready, I'm going to need you to do one more thing for me. Something that's going to feel like the opposite of what your instincts tell you to do." "Which is what?" "Steal something he's going to want very badly," Mason said. "Except I'm going to be the one who decides what it is." She stared at him. Down the hallway, the building's HVAC system cycled on, the low vibration of it moving through the walls and the floor under their feet. Outside, Fort Worth was doing whatever it did at 1 in the morning, which was mostly sleep. Rachel Kim let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very far down. "Okay," she said, and that was how Mason Calloway, who had spent 8 years trying to become invisible, found himself with an informant, an active target, and the growing certainty that whoever had opened the door to Vincent Crow at Langford Defense Systems was someone much closer to Audrey than a decommissioned server room. He drove home in the dark. He checked the lock. He looked in on Ellie, who had rearranged the stuffed animals since he left, and was now sleeping with her arm thrown over the largest one, which was a brown bear named Gerald, that she'd had since she was 2, and that he would carry out of a burning building before virtually anything else he owned. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he went to bed and did not sleep particularly well, and in the morning he made her breakfast and drove her to school himself, and watched until she was through the front door and inside before he put the truck in gear and drove away. The trap took 11 days to build. Mason didn't rush it, which was the hardest part. Not the technical construction, not the logistics, but the patience required to do it right when every instinct was telling him to move faster. Speed was the enemy of precision, and precision was the only thing that was going to put Vincent Crowe somewhere he couldn't get out of. He worked on the bait files at night, after Ellie was asleep, sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop and a legal pad, where he wrote nothing that looked like anything if someone picked it up. The specifications he constructed were extraordinary in their near perfection. He'd requested access to Langford's actual guidance system documentation through Audrey, framed as necessary for his cover as a building systems consultant. Cross-referencing electrical load requirements, and he'd spent 3 nights studying them closely enough to understand what a real set of classified specs looked like from the inside. The mathematics, the formatting conventions, the internal reference codes, the specific way Langford's engineering team labeled subsystem components. Then he built a copy that was almost exactly right. Almost. The deviations were subtle enough that a casual review would miss them entirely. Even a thorough review by someone who wasn't an expert in this specific system would likely pass it. But embedded in the file structure, invisible to any standard examination, was a tracking package. Not sophisticated by intelligence community standards, but functional, persistent, and attached to a monitoring system that would log every device that opened the file, every network it touched, and every location it passed through. He explained the technical elements to Rachel on a Wednesday evening in the parking garage of a shopping center 3 miles from Langford's main building, sitting in his truck with the windows up. She listened without interrupting, which he appreciated. "The file needs to look like it came from the right place," he said, "which means it needs to enter the hidden server room through the normal access point, which means you." Rachel was quiet for a moment. She'd been quiet a lot since the hallway. Not shut down, just processing. She had the kind of mind that worked carefully and didn't perform certainty it didn't have. "He contacts me through an encrypted channel," she said. "Gives me target files a week in advance. Tells me what format he needs them in." "Does he ever deviate from that schedule?" "Twice. Both times when something changed on his end. He went dark for 4 days once, and then came back with a new request like nothing happened." "What was the new request?" "Personnel files. Senior engineering staff. Names, clearance levels, project assignments." Mason filed that. "When's his next scheduled contact?" 3 days? He usually sends the request Thursday night for a Saturday delivery." "Then we have 3 days." He looked at her. "Can you make the switch without him knowing the file is different?" She thought about it. "The format will match. The file size is close enough. He doesn't validate content on receipt. He passes it on." She paused. "Who does he pass it to?" "That's what we're going to find out." She nodded slowly. Then, "What happens to my sister while all this is happening?" It was the question she'd been holding since the parking garage last week, Mason could tell. She'd asked it then too the first night, and he'd given her an answer that was true, but incomplete. He'd said he had contacts. He hadn't been specific. "I made some calls," he said. "There's an immigration attorney in Dallas named Vera Cho. She's handled national security adjacency cases before, which means she knows how to work around federal complications without triggering the wrong attention. She's agreed to take a preliminary look at your sister's file at no charge, and if there's a path forward, she's confident she can find it." He paused. "She's not connected to Langford. She's not connected to anything Crowe can reach. I've known her for about 6 years. She's good." Rachel stared out the windshield for a moment. "You've known her for 6 years," she said. "You're a building systems contractor." "I used to be other things," he said. She turned to look at him. In the flat overhead light of the parking garage, she looked tired and younger than her age, and considerably more grounded than someone in her position had a right to be. "What kind of other things?" He didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. She looked away. "Okay," she said. "I'll move the file Saturday." He drove home. He made Ellie's lunch for the next day. Turkey sandwich again, because she'd rejected the ham experiment of the previous week with the specific diplomatic brutality that children reserve for food, and stood in the kitchen for a while after, not quite ready for the quiet of the rest of the evening. He thought about Damien Holt. He'd been thinking about Damien Holt for days, turning it over the way you turn over a problem that doesn't feel solved even when the math says it is. He'd run everything Rachel had given him against everything he'd observed about the building's patterns, and the through line kept landing in the same place. The hidden server room's access history, the specific files Crowe had requested over the past 14 months. Files that required not just technical access, but organizational knowledge. The kind of knowledge that told you which projects were under pressure, which personnel were in positions to be approached, which internal reviews were generating the kind of documentation that could be weaponized against a federal contract. That wasn't IT knowledge. That was security leadership knowledge. The kind of knowledge that came from sitting in executive meetings and having a broad view of everything the company's right hand was doing while the left hand looked the other way. 4 years at Langford, hired by Audrey's father, which meant Damien had been there before Audrey took over, which meant he'd had time to build the kind of institutional familiarity that made him functionally invisible to the people around him. Trusted people stopped being examined. That was the whole mechanism. Mason thought about telling Audrey. He decided to wait until he had the tracker data. Suspicion wasn't evidence. Suspicion wouldn't hold in a boardroom or a federal investigation, and the only thing worse than not catching Damien Holt would be alerting him before the net was closed. He went to bed. Saturday came. He was in his truck 2 blocks from Langford's building at 11:45 p.m. He was running the tracker monitoring software on his laptop through a mobile connection. He'd explained to Diane that he had another late work situation, which Diane had accepted with the gracious willingness of someone who had clearly decided he was a decent enough person that his explanations didn't need to be scrutinized. Rachel messaged him at 12:18. 2 words. File moved. He watched the tracker log. For 14 minutes, nothing. The file sat in the server room's internal architecture, unaccessed. Mason drank cold coffee and watched the cursor blink. At 12:32, the file was opened. Device signature, a laptop registered to a commercial IP address in the West Park Business District. The file was viewed for approximately 90 seconds, long enough to confirm it looked right, not long enough to examine it carefully, and then copied and transmitted outward. The transmission went to an external server. The server resolved to a hosting provider with addresses registered through 4 layers of shell company, which was exactly the kind of structure that looked like it was trying hard to be untraceable, and which was, as a result, traceable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Mason spent the next 2 hours following the chain. He was good at this. Not the technical side, which he managed adequately but not brilliantly, but the logical side, the part where you stopped following the data and started following the decisions behind the data. Who structured these shells, and in what order, and what did the order tell you about how they thought about risk? The architecture of concealment was always a self-portrait of the person doing the concealing. By 2:45 in the morning, he had a name. Meridian Analytical Group, a defense technology consulting firm incorporated in Delaware 18 months ago, with an office address in Dallas that resolved to a co-working space, a staff roster of 11 people that included 2 former Langford engineers who had left the company in the past year, and a primary client list that included Dynacorp Federal Solutions, Langford Defense Systems' largest direct competitor for the contract currently under threat. He photographed everything. He built a document on his laptop that cross-referenced the shell company chain, the file transmission metadata, the access logs from the hidden server room, and the personnel connections. He saved it in 3 places. Then he called Audrey. She picked up on the 4th ring, which meant she'd been asleep. Mason. I have the chain, he said, from the server room to Crow to Dynacorp. It's documented. A silence. He could hear her breathing change. Not panic, something more controlled than that. The sound of someone absorbing information they'd been dreading and had also been waiting for. How solid is it? Solid enough for federal investigators to pull the thread. The shells aren't airtight. Whoever structured them was competent, but not exceptional. There are gaps. He paused. Audrey. The access log from the server room shows who opened the file tonight. The badge data, the device registration, the internal network signature. It all points to one account. Tell me. Damien Holt. The silence this time was different. Longer. Damien, she said. Yes. Another pause. How long? The earliest access pattern I can identify is 14 months ago, which means he was already working with Crow before your second board meeting about the acquisition offer. He let that sit for a moment. He wasn't just passing information, he was shaping what Crow knew before each approach, so Crow could calibrate his offers and his pressure. Your security director was writing Crow's playbook. He heard her exhale. Not a gasp, nothing dramatic, Just a slow release of breath, the kind that happens when something you'd begun to suspect becomes confirmed, and the confirmation is somehow still worse than the suspicion. "He came to my father's funeral," she said quietly. "He stood next to me at the reception." Mason didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say to that. "What do we do?" she said. It wasn't a helpless question, it was a practical one. "We need Crow himself to make a move that ties him directly to the operation," Mason said. "Right now the chain connects to Damien and to Dynacorp, but Crow is insulated. He's used enough intermediaries that his direct fingerprints aren't on anything yet. We need him to reach for something personally. How do we make that happen?" "We give him something he can't send someone else to get," he said. "Something that feels like it could blow the whole operation wide open if anyone else sees it first. Something he has to handle himself." She was quiet for a moment. "A document," she said. "A document," he agreed. "Something Damien overhears you talking about. Something that sounds like you've figured out more than you actually have. Like you've got a paper trail that could expose the whole conspiracy, and it's somewhere he can find." "My home office," Audrey said. Not a question. Working it out. "He knows my house. He's been there for security walkthroughs." "Does he know where you keep sensitive documents?" "He would assume the locked drawer in my desk. It's where I keep anything I don't want on the network." "Then that's where we put it," Mason said. "And when Crow breaks in to get it, you'll be there," she said. "I'll be there." He heard her breath steady on the other end of the line. "When?" "Give it a week. Long enough for Damien to hear something and report it. Not so long that Crow has time to overthink it or find another angle." He paused. "This week, act normally. Don't avoid Damien. If anything, give him access to a meeting where you mention, not obviously, just in passing, that you've uncovered documentation about the leak. Let him think you're closing in on something." "He'll move fast," she said. "If he thinks I'm on to the operation, that's the point," Mason said. "We want him to move fast. Fast people make mistakes." He drove home as the sky was starting to lighten at the eastern edge, that particular blue-gray that preceded dawn by about 40 minutes in the Texas fall. He was tired in a way that had layers to it, physically, yes, but also the specific mental fatigue of sustained hypervigilance, of spending every hour alert to things that other people didn't notice and didn't need to. He slept for 3 hours. He got up and made pancakes. Ellie came to the breakfast table in her pajamas with her hair chaotic and her eyes at about 60% operational capacity, and said, "How come you made pancakes?" "Because it's Sunday. You don't usually make pancakes on Sunday." "I do sometimes." She sat down and examined the plate with appropriate suspicion. "Are you trying to tell me something?" He sat across from her. "Like what?" "I don't know. When Miss Portman needs to tell us something bad, she always brings donuts first." She picked up her fork. "It's a pattern." He looked at his daughter, who was 8 years old and had apparently developed the observational habits of someone considerably older, and felt the complicated mixture of pride and worry that had been his baseline emotional state for approximately 8 years. "No bad news," he said. "Just pancakes." She ate them with the focused appreciation of someone who had decided to reserve judgment but was leaning toward accepting the explanation. "Can we go to the park today?" "Sure." "The one with the creek, not the one with the broken swing set." "The creek park," he confirmed. They went. He pushed her on the swings for a while. She was getting to the age where she could pump herself but still liked being pushed, and he understood that was a window with a closing date, so he pushed every time she asked, and then she spent 45 minutes navigating the creek bed looking for interesting rocks. While he sat on the bank and watched her and thought about Damien Holt standing at a funeral reception, and thought about Crow's voice in a restaurant, and thought about a child being walked out of a school in the arms of strangers with forged paperwork. That last thought had been sitting at the back of his mind since Thursday, and he kept pushing it away and it kept coming back. He knew Crow's pattern now. He'd seen it in the restaurant, the escalation, the test of boundaries, the willingness to use whatever leverage was available. Crow had sent a man to the school fence. That had been a message, a signal that he knew where to find pressure. Mason had responded by taking Audrey's offer, which Crow would likely have anticipated. So the next escalation, if one came, wouldn't be another message. It would be an action. He called the school Monday morning and spoke to Linda Ferris and asked about the protocol for early dismissal. Who could authorize it? What documentation was required? what the procedure was if someone arrived with legal paperwork. Linda told him, a parent or listed guardian with photo ID matching the enrollment record. Any other party required written authorization from the parent on file, and for anything unusual, custody disputes, protective orders, anything outside routine, the school had a code word system that any parent could set up with the front office. He set one up that afternoon. The word was Gerald, which Ellie had suggested without knowing why he was asking, because he'd framed it as a school safety thing, and she'd accepted this and immediately proposed the bear's name with complete seriousness. If anyone ever calls and asks you to go with them and you're not sure, he told her that evening, helping with homework at the kitchen table, and I'm not there, you ask them the word. She looked up from her worksheet. And if they don't know it? You go directly to a teacher or Linda in the front office. You don't go anywhere with anyone. She absorbed this. She was smart enough to know this wasn't hypothetical in the normal way safety conversations were hypothetical, but she was also young enough to trust his framing of it. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. She went back to her math. He watched her for a moment. The way she held her pencil wrong but wrote neatly anyway. The way she bit the inside of her cheek when a problem was giving her trouble. And then looked down at his own legal pad and went back to working the timeline. Wednesday, Audrey called him. Her voice was controlled in a way that meant she was in a space where she couldn't talk freely. I had a department head meeting this morning, she said. Standard quarterly review. Damien was there. A pause that was calibrated to sound casual. I mentioned, in the context of our federal audit preparation, that our legal team had finished compiling a comprehensive internal review document. I said it was something I was keeping close until we were ready to move on it. Did he react? No, which is how I knew he was paying attention. Mason almost smiled. Good. How long? She asked. Give him 48 hours to report. Then we set the document. He spent the next 2 days constructing the planted evidence, a 43-page document that looked exactly like what Audrey had described. Internal review letterhead, legal team signatures that matched Langford's actual legal counsel format, a detailed narrative that made it appear as though Audrey's team had traced the leak back to the server room, identified the shell company structure, and was 2 days away from a formal submission to federal investigators. It named names. It referenced dates. It was, in every detectable way, exactly the kind of document that would make Crow's entire operation collapse if it reached the wrong hands. It also contained, in the document metadata and in a nearly invisible embedded element in the file's structural encoding, the same tracking package he'd used in the guidance system files. Mason delivered it to Audrey in person. A brief exchange in the parking garage of Langford's building, tucked inside a manila envelope inside a plain canvas bag, the kind of unremarkable transaction that security cameras would find completely uninteresting. Locked drawer, he said. Locked drawer, she confirmed. Friday night, he said. If the pattern holds, Crow won't wait through a weekend. He'll want that document before business hours Monday, which means he comes Friday night or Saturday at the latest. You'll be in the house. I'll be in the house before he is. She looked at him for a moment in the parking garage light. She'd lost weight in the past 2 weeks, he thought. Not dramatically, just the particular gauntness that comes from sustained stress and interrupted sleep. She was holding together well, better than most people would, but she was holding together through effort rather than ease, and the effort was accumulating. Are you all right? He asked. She seemed mildly surprised by the question. I'm fine. You don't have to say that to me. A pause. She looked away briefly. I keep thinking about the people on my team who didn't do anything wrong. The engineers who've been working on this contract for 3 years, doing good work, and the whole time someone in my own security division was systematically undermining it. She shook her head slightly. My father built this company. He built it because he believed that the work mattered, that protecting people mattered. And I let a man like Damien Holt. You didn't let anything, Mason said. Damien Holt made a decision. Crow made a decision. Those aren't yours. She looked back at him. I hired him. Your father hired him. I kept him on. With no reason not to, he said. That's not negligence. That's trust. And the problem with trust is that it's only visible in retrospect when it was misplaced. In the moment, it just looks like doing your job. She was quiet for a moment. Then, you're better at this than I expected. At what? She seemed to search for the right word. The human part. He didn't entirely know what to do with that, so he didn't respond to it directly. Friday night, he said. I'll confirm position by 8 p.m. He drove home. Thursday passed. Friday morning came with a cold front that pushed down from the panhandle and made the air feel like October had finally decided to commit. Mason made Ellie's lunch, drove her to school, confirmed with Diane that she'd handle pickup and dinner, and spent the day at Langford completing his contracted building systems work, with the particular focus of someone who was trying to be in two mental places at once and not do either one poorly. At 4:45, his phone buzzed. A message from Rachel, through the encrypted channel he'd set up. DH left building 4:30. No bag. Walking pattern not toward parking. Which meant Damian Holt had left the building on foot with no bag, which suggested he was going somewhere he didn't want a vehicle trail to and something he could carry. He hadn't taken his laptop bag, which meant he wasn't planning to be gone long, which meant whatever he was doing was close. Mason left the building at 5. He drove to Audrey's neighborhood, parked on the adjacent street, and walked the remaining distance with his hands in his jacket pockets and his head down, moving like a man who was cutting through on his way somewhere else. He'd been to Audrey's house twice before and had studied the layout carefully both times, the kind of professional attentiveness that Audrey had noticed on his second visit and commented on, and that he'd deflected with something vague about safety awareness. He let himself in through the back door. Audrey had given him a key, and leaving it unlocked from the inside would have been the kind of unnecessary risk that annoyed him in principle. He moved through the kitchen into the hall and up to the second floor and found a position in the office itself. Behind the door, which he left mostly closed, in the corner where the closet created a deep enough shadow that someone entering from the hallway would cross most of the room before their eyes fully adjusted. He waited. At 8:17 p.m., Audrey texted him. Someone tripped the sensor on the back garden gate. At 8:21, he heard the sound of a window in the downstairs study. Not breaking. A clean entry, a window that had been assessed in advance, probably during a security walkthrough. Professional enough to be quiet, human enough to not be silent. Footsteps on the stairs. One person, careful footing, the particular rhythm of someone moving quickly but trying to minimize noise. They knew the layout. Of course they did. The office door opened. Vincent Crowe came into the room. He was wearing dark clothes, which struck Mason as slightly absurd given that he was 60 years old and worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and had presumably told himself this was a controlled, manageable action rather than the burglary it actually was. He had a small flashlight, high-end, the kind that threw a focused beam. He crossed directly to the desk without hesitation, knowing exactly where he was going. He found the locked drawer. He produced a small tool, a slim pick, practiced hands, and the lock gave in under 30 seconds. He opened the drawer. He found the envelope. He opened it. He stood reading the first page of the document with his flashlight, and Mason watched him in the dark and waited. After about a minute, Crowe's posture changed, subtly but visibly. The particular tensing of someone who has just confirmed that the thing they came to destroy actually exists and is actually as dangerous as they feared. Mason reached over and turned on the office light. Crowe spun around. Mason was standing between him and the door, which was closed. He had his hands at his sides and nothing in them, and he looked at Crowe with the same expression he'd had at the restaurant, that absence of fear that communicated things words couldn't. For a moment, neither man spoke. Crowe recovered fast. Faster than most people would have, which told Mason something about what was underneath the expensive suit. Not just money and entitlement, but something tougher, the kind of person who had navigated genuine danger before and had learned to function inside it. "Mr. Calloway," Crowe said. His voice was steady. It wasn't entirely unimpressive. "Mr. Crowe," Mason said. Crowe looked around the room in a way that was smooth enough to look casual, checking exits, calculating options, finding what Mason had already known he'd find, which was that the only way out was past Mason. "I'm prepared," Crowe said, "to make this conversation very simple. Whatever Langford is paying you, double. Whatever you think you're protecting, I can protect it better. You have a daughter, private school, college fund, a safety net so solid she never has to worry about—" "Don't," Mason said. The word was quiet. Not threatening, just a door closing. Crowe stopped. You came into this woman's house to steal a document, Mason said. The document has a tracker in it. You've been holding it for 4 minutes, which is long enough. There are cameras in this room. Federal investigators have been parked on the street since 7 p.m. He paused. You drove here yourself. No intermediary. Which means everything you've spent 14 months keeping at arm's length, just put your own hands on it. Crow looked at the document in his hands. He looked at Mason. Something moved across his face. Not quite fear, not quite anger. The specific expression of a man who has just watched the calculation he's been running come out differently than he planned, and who is now running it again to see if there's a variable he missed. He hadn't missed one. You're a mechanic, Crow said. I used to be other things, Mason said. A long moment. Downstairs, the front door opened. 2 federal agents, a woman and a man, came up the stairs. Mason had confirmed their position outside at 7:50 and given them a signal code through Audrey, who was at a hotel across the city and had been watching the sensor alerts on her phone with a control that Mason suspected was costing her considerably. The agents entered the office. Crow looked at them. He looked at Mason. He looked at the document in his hands. Then he set it down on the desk, carefully, with the particular care of a man who has decided that his next move is his attorney's problem rather than his own. I'd like to call my lawyer, he said. That's your right, the female agent said. They cuffed him. They walked him out. Mason stood in the office and listened to the footsteps descend the stairs and cross the entryway and go out the front door, and then it was quiet. He stood there for a moment. The office was exactly as it had been. Desk, locked drawer now open, document sitting where Crow had left it. The lamp cast everything in a warm, ordinary light that didn't match what had just happened in it at all. His phone rang. Audrey. It's done, he said, a long exhale on the other end. Are you okay? Fine. The agents, they have him. He'll be processed tonight. He picked up the document, put it back in the envelope. Audrey, it's not over yet. I know, she said. The attorneys start tomorrow. Crow is going to... I know, she said again. Steadier now. One thing at a time. Tonight, I just want to know it's done. He understood that. It's done, he said again. He drove to Diane's to pick up Ellie, who had been given dinner and a movie and was in a state of profound contentment that took approximately 4 minutes to replace with outrage when Mason said they needed to go home because it was a school night. In the car, she leaned her head against the window and watched the lights of the city pass and said, without preamble, You seem different. Different how? I don't know. Less... She searched for the word. Less like you're waiting for something. Kept his eyes on the road. 8 years old, he thought. 8 years old and reading things that took adults decades to name. Maybe I am, he said. She accepted this and closed her eyes and was mostly asleep by the time he pulled into the driveway. He carried her inside. She was getting almost too big to carry, but not quite, not yet, and put her in bed with Gerald positioned correctly according to the arrangement he'd been taught and the lights off the way she liked. He stood in the doorway for a moment in the dark. He thought about Crow's face when the lights came on. He thought about the calculation that had run across the man's features and come up empty. He thought about 3 bodyguards in a restaurant who had looked at Mason and quietly decided not to. He thought about the man who used to make those calculations from the other side of them, a younger version of himself, in places he still didn't name out loud, making decisions in the dark with the same cold, patient competence he'd brought into Audrey Langford's office tonight. He had never missed that life. Not once. He missed the people in it sometimes, the ones who hadn't come back. That was a different thing, a weight he'd carried so long it had become part of his balance, and he no longer noticed it except on certain kinds of quiet nights. But the work itself, the danger itself, no. What he'd felt tonight, standing in the dark waiting for Crow, hadn't been the specific thrill of that old life. It had been something quieter and more grounded, the satisfaction of a man who had done a hard thing correctly, in service of people who had needed him to. That was different. He went to the kitchen and fixed the leak under the sink that he'd been meaning to fix for 3 months, working in the small hours with a flashlight and a wrench while the house slept around him. And by the time he finished and cleaned up the water and put the tools away, it was nearly 2 in the morning. He washed his hands. He went to bed. And for the first time in weeks, he slept without incident until the alarm went off at 5:30, and the first thing he did when he got up was start Ellie's lunch. The news cycle moved faster than Mason had anticipated, which was his first miscalculation, and it cost him. By Sunday morning, less than 36 hours after Crow's arrest, the story had leaked. Not the full story, not the version with evidence and context, and the 14 months of documented conspiracy behind it. Just enough. A prominent defense investor detained in connection with an investigation into Langford Defense Systems. A billion-dollar federal contract under scrutiny, and buried in the third paragraph of a Dallas Business Journal article that got picked up by 2 national outlets before noon, the name Mason Calloway, identified as a security contractor who had recently been granted access to Langford's restricted systems documentation. Mason read the article on his phone at the kitchen table while Ellie ate cereal across from him, and he felt something settle in his chest that wasn't quite dread but was adjacent to it. Crow's attorneys had been busy overnight. He called Audrey at 8:15. She picked up immediately, which meant she'd been awake for a while. "I've seen it," she said. "Who talked to the Journal?" "I don't know yet. My legal team is trying to find out. It could be Crow's people. It could be someone at the federal level who shouldn't have been talking." A pause. "Mason, they're framing it as if the investigation is about Langford rather than about Crow. The language is very careful. They're not saying you did anything wrong. They're just placing me at the scene," he said. Yes. He understood the mechanism immediately. The way you understand something you've been trained to recognize even in unfamiliar configurations. Crow's attorneys weren't going to argue he was innocent in the arrest room. That battle would be fought later, in court, over months. What they were doing right now was muddying the water, creating an alternative narrative that investigators and journalists and eventually jurors would have heard before the trial ever started. If Mason Calloway had access to restricted systems, if Mason Calloway had a sealed military record, if Mason Calloway had constructed the very files that were used in the alleged sting operation, then maybe the question wasn't whether Vincent Crow had stolen classified technology. Maybe the question was who had actually engineered the whole thing and why. It was a good move. He could appreciate its construction even while understanding exactly how badly it could damage everything they'd built. "I need to know what federal investigators are saying," he said. "My attorney is making calls this morning. We should know more by afternoon." "And Damien?" A beat. "His attorney contacted mine last night. He's considering his options." Which meant Damien was calculating whether cooperation was better than conviction, and his attorneys were communicating that calculation indirectly as a form of negotiating pressure. Standard procedure. It meant they were worried, which was accurate, but it also meant the timeline was moving faster than Mason had planned for. He needed to get in front of this before the narrative calcified. "Can you get a meeting?" he said. "Board, investigators, defense counsel, everyone in one room. I need to walk through the full evidence chain before Crow's team has another 24 hours to shape the story." Silence on the other end. He could hear her thinking. The board is going to be difficult. Half of them are nervous about federal exposure on the contract and the other half are nervous about liability, and none of them particularly like surprises. "I know," he said. "But if I'm not in a room explaining what actually happened before someone else explains their version of it, we lose the initiative. And once you lose the initiative in something like this, getting it back is expensive." Another pause. "I'll make the calls," she said. He spent the morning in a particular kind of suspended alertness, doing the ordinary things. Making Ellie's breakfast, helping her find where she'd left her library book, listening to a 15-minute account of a disagreement between Cora and another girl at school that had apparently reached a resolution but left diplomatic complications, while his mind ran parallel tracks on everything that needed to happen before the week was out. At 11:30, Ellie looked up from the couch where she was reading and said, "You're doing the thing where you're here, but not here." He looked at her. "What thing?" "The thing where you answer, but you're not listening. You said that's interesting when I told you Cora ate a crayon." He hadn't registered saying that. "When did Cora eat a crayon?" "She didn't. I made it up to see if you were listening." She turned a page. "It's okay. You're thinking about work stuff." "I am," he said. "I'm sorry." "It's fine." She paused. "Is the work stuff going okay?" He considered how to answer that for a moment. "It's getting complicated," he said, "but I think it'll be okay." She appeared to accept this. "Gerald fell behind the bed last night," she said. "I had to get up and find him at like 2 in the morning." You should have come and gotten me." "I found him," she said, with the particular dignity of someone who had handled their own problem and felt good about it. He drove her to Diane's at 1 o'clock. On the way, she asked him to turn up the radio, and he did. And she sang along to something he didn't recognize with the unself-conscious competence of a child who had not yet learned to be embarrassed about singing in cars. He watched the road and listened and thought that this specific moment, radio and her voice and the familiar route, was what he was protecting, not in the abstract. This. He dropped her off and drove to Langford's building and spent 2 hours in the conference room with Audrey's general counsel, a sharp-edged woman named Patricia Wren, who had the demeanor of someone who had been in worse situations than this and had simply not allowed them to get the better of her. Patricia walked him through the federal investigators' current position. They were not, at this moment, treating Mason as a suspect, but they were treating him as a person of significant interest whose role in the operation required clarification, which in legal terms was a meaningful distinction that was also considerably less comfortable than it sounded. "The issue," Patricia said, spreading documents across the table with the efficiency of someone who sorted problems the way other people sorted laundry, "is that your access to Langford's systems was unauthorized in the strictest technical sense. Yes, Audrey authorized it, but she authorized it verbally and informally, without board approval and without documented security clearance, which means that Crow's attorneys can characterize it as an independent incursion into a defense contractor's restricted infrastructure by a person with a sealed classified background." "Which is what they're doing," Mason said. "Which is what they're doing," she confirmed. "The good news is that the evidence chain is solid. The tracker data, the server room access logs, the shell company documentation, the cameras in Audrey's office. It's a strong package. The bad news is that a strong package takes time to explain to a jury, and Crow's people are betting that what they can do in the press in the next 72 hours creates enough noise that the explanation becomes harder to hear." Mason looked at the documents spread across the table, everything he'd built over the past 3 weeks, laid out in the flat language of legal notation. "When is the board meeting?" "Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. We've confirmed federal investigators will attend as observers, defense contract representatives from the Oversight Office. Damian Holt's attorney has also requested to be present, which tells me they're further along in the cooperation calculation than they're letting on officially." "Damian will be there?" "We're told yes. His attorney says he wants to hear the full evidence presentation before his client makes any formal decisions." Patricia looked at him over the top of her reading glasses. "Which means, if your presentation is as solid as Audrey believes it is, we may walk out of that room with Damian Holt's cooperation in hand." Mason nodded. "There's one more thing," Patricia said. She said it in the specific tone of someone who has been saving the most difficult item for the end because they weren't sure how the person across the table was going to take it. "The federal investigators are going to want your background, not a summary, the actual history. If you walk into that room and present as a civilian contractor who happened to know how to construct a digital tracker and follow a money chain through 4 layers of shell company, the first question they ask is going to be where that knowledge came from. Crow's attorneys are already seeding the idea that your background is relevant to the investigation. The only way to get ahead of that is to speak to it yourself." Mason was quiet for a moment. He'd known this was coming. He'd known it since the article that morning, probably since the night he'd walked into Audrey's office and turned on the light and found Crow holding a document that had Mason's technical fingerprints all over it. He'd spent 8 years not saying the words out loud. Not because they were shameful. They weren't. He'd never felt shame about what he'd been or what he'd done. Not exactly. But because the life he'd built since required a certain kind of anonymity, and that anonymity was one of the things that kept Ellie's world the size and shape it was supposed to be. An ordinary house, an ordinary school, an ordinary father who was home every night. He thought about the man at the school fence. He thought about 2 men with forged documents who had known her name, known her face, walked into an elementary school and tried to walk out with his daughter. "All right," he said. Patricia looked at him. "You'll speak to your background?" "I'll speak to it," he said. He drove home that evening and made dinner for himself, just himself, which always felt slightly wrong, the portions slightly off, and sat at the kitchen table afterward with a yellow legal pad and wrote down, in rough outline, the shape of what he was going to say the next morning. Not a speech. He had no interest in speeches, just the structure, what he'd done, what it had cost, why he'd walked away, and what any of it had to do with a hidden server room in the West Park Business District. He wrote for about an hour. Then he set the legal pad aside and looked at what he'd written and felt the strange distance of seeing your own life summarized in bullet points and short declarative sentences. The way a story becomes unrecognizable when you strip the living out of it and leave only the facts. He picked up his phone and called the number for the federal investigator who had given Audrey his card at the arrest. Special Agent Dennis Farrow picked up on the third ring. "Mr. Calloway," Farrow said. Not surprised. He'd probably been expecting this call. "I want to speak with you before tomorrow's meeting," Mason said. "Tonight, if possible. There are things you should hear from me directly rather than in a room with 12 other people." A pause. "I can be at my office in 40 minutes. "I'll be there," Mason said. He was there in 35. Farrow's office was on the 14th floor of a federal building downtown, the kind of office that was deliberately unremarkable. Gray carpet, fluorescent overhead, a desk with more paper on it than any single filing system could justify. Farrow was 50-something, compact, with the patient attentiveness of someone who had spent decades listening to people tell him things and had developed a very good sense of what the pauses meant. Mason sat across the desk and talked for 40 minutes without stopping. He didn't go into classified operational specifics. Those remained sealed, and he had no intention of breaking that seal, both because it was the law and because some of what lived behind it involved people other than himself. But he talked about the structure of his service, the length of it, the nature of the work, in terms general enough to be accurate without being actionable. He talked about why he'd separated, not disgraced, not forced out, not traumatized into incapacity, but finished, genuinely finished. He'd done the work he was capable of doing and reached a point where the work he needed to do was somewhere else. He talked about Ellie's mother, briefly, which was a territory he rarely entered but which was relevant here because it explained the specific shape of the life he'd built since. He talked about the night at Carver's Grill. He talked about Audrey's offer and his refusal and the man at the school fence and why the fence changed his calculus. He talked through every decision he'd made inside Langford Defense, methodically and in sequence, explaining the reasoning behind each one. Farrow listened. He took notes in a handwriting that was too small to read upside down. When Mason finished, Farrow set down his pen and looked at him for a moment. "You built the poison file," he said. "Yes." "And the tracker?" "Yes." "And you were the one who identified both Damian Holt and the shell company chain independently before bringing it to federal attention?" "Yes." Farrow was quiet. "Why come to me tonight rather than letting your attorney do this in the morning?" Mason looked at him. "Because attorneys translate," he said. "What I'm telling you is accurate, and I'd rather you hear it in my words than in someone else's version of my words." Another pause. Farrow looked down at his notes. "You understand that the sealed record creates a verification problem. I can confirm the outline of your service through channels, but the specifics are sealed," Mason said. "That won't change. But the outline is enough to establish that I know how to do what I did at Langford because I was trained to do it, not because I was building a conspiracy." He paused. "The evidence against Crow exists regardless of who I am. The tracker data stands on its own. The shell companies stand on their own. The cameras in the office stand on their own. My background explains my methodology. It doesn't change what the evidence shows." Farrow studied him for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "It doesn't." Mason drove home at 9:45. He checked the lock. He called Diane and confirmed Ellie's morning. Diane would take her to school so Mason could be at Langford by 7:30. He packed nothing for the morning because there was nothing to pack. The evidence was already compiled, already in the hands of federal attorneys and Patricia Wren and the investigators. What he was bringing into that boardroom tomorrow was himself, which was a thing he'd spent 8 years keeping out of rooms like that. He slept badly. Not from anxiety exactly. It was more physical than that, the body's resistance to rest when it knows something is coming. He woke twice, once at 1:15 and once at 3:40, and lay in the dark listening to the specific nighttime sounds of the house until they sorted themselves back into ordinary. At 5:30 he got up. He made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table for a while with the legal pad from the night before, reading what he'd written and adding nothing to it. At 6:15, because he had time and because it was a thing he needed to do, he called Ellie at Diane's. Diane answered and passed the phone over with the cheerful efficiency of someone who had a functional morning underway. "Dad?" Ellie said. She sounded slightly fuzzy with early morning, but fundamentally operational. "Hey, just wanted to hear your voice." "I'm fine." A pause. "Are you okay?" "I'm good. I have a big meeting today." "Like boring work meeting or important work meeting?" "Important." She was quiet for a moment. "You'll do good," she said. It was the particular phrasing of a child who had not yet learned to say well in that context, and he had no plans to correct it. "Thanks, Bug." "Can we get pizza tonight? The one with the garlic knots?" "Yeah," he said. "We can do that." He drove to Langford. He was in the building by 7:20, in the conference room by 7:30, where Patricia Wren was already there with 2 associates and enough printed documentation to fill a wheeled cart. She looked at him, assessed something in his face, and said, "How are we?" "Ready," he said. She nodded as if that was both expected and sufficient. The room filled between 7:40 and 8. Audrey's board members, 7 of them, arranged on one side of the long table, with the particular careful blankness of people who had been advised by their own attorneys to observe and not commit. Federal investigators, Farrow and 2 colleagues, in chairs along the wall rather than at the table, which was their standard positioning and communicated their role as witnesses to rather than participants in the proceedings. 2 representatives from the Defense Contract Oversight Office, who had flown in from D.C. and were visibly unhappy about it, Patricia and her associates, Audrey's 3 senior attorneys, and Damien Holt at the far end of the table with his attorney beside him. Mason hadn't seen Damien since before the Friday night operation. He looked at him now and found the experience somewhat anticlimactic. 4 years of trust, 14 months of betrayal, and what was sitting at the end of the table was just a man in a blue suit who looked like he hadn't slept well. Late 40s, square-jawed, the kind of face that read as reliable because it was still and even-featured and communicated nothing unless you knew what to look for. Damien looked back at him. Something passed between them that wasn't quite acknowledgement and wasn't quite anything else. Then Damien looked away. Audrey came in at 8 o'clock. She sat at the head of the table, and Mason noticed that she sat there differently than he'd seen her sit in other rooms. Straighter, more deliberate. The posture of someone who has decided that the room belongs to them and is making that decision visible. She'd slept, probably not enough, but she'd slept. She had on a dark blazer, and her hair pulled back and the expression of a woman who had spent 2 weeks being afraid and had decided this morning was where that ended. She introduced Mason without preamble. Then she looked at him and said simply, "Go ahead." He stood. He started with the server room. The hidden server room that shouldn't have been active, that he'd found on the second day of his building systems review, that the facility's records showed as decommissioned. He walked through what he'd found there and how he'd found it. He walked through Rachel Kim, her role, the coercion she'd operated under, the decision she'd made to cooperate. He explained the construction of the bait files, the tracking package, the chain of transmission from the server room to the external hosting server to the shell company to Dynacorp's subsidiary. He put everything on the wall display as he went. Documents, access logs, financial records, corporate registration filings, metadata from the transmitted files. The room was quiet, in the way that rooms get quiet, when the thing being presented is sufficiently clear that commentary would only complicate it. Then he came to Damien. He didn't look at Damien when he spoke his name. He kept his eyes on the display and walked through the access pattern, the server room badge records, the device signature from the night the tracking file was opened, the specific internal network routing that connected that device to an account registered to Langford's security division, to a workstation assigned to the head of security. 14 months of access. 14 months of documents passed from Langford's security director to a hidden server to Vincent Crowe to Dynacorp. The dates aligned with every significant moment in the contract's deterioration, every surprise validation failure, every unexpected technical challenge, every moment when Crowe had known something he shouldn't have known before Audrey's next board meeting. He walked through the forged documents sent to the elementary school. He had the document examiner's report, obtained through federal channels in the days after the incident, that traced the paper stock and the printer signature to a commercial service used by one of Crowe's shell company employees. He walked through the construction of the planted evidence in Audrey's home office, the tracking package, the cameras, the federal presence outside. Crow's arrival, his entry through the downstairs window, his access of the locked drawer. The 47 minutes of footage from 3 angles that showed Vincent Crow, in his own person, committing the crime his 14-month operation had been designed to avoid any personal connection to. At some point during this section, Damien's attorney leaned over and said something quietly to his client. Damien said something back. The attorney wrote a note on his legal pad. Mason finished the evidence presentation and remained standing. Patricia Wren took over briefly to address the legal framework, the federal statutes implicated, the contract oversight violations, the specific charges that had been filed against Crow the previous evening and that would likely be expanded in the coming weeks. Then one of the board members, a man named Hewitt, 60s, who had said nothing so far and had the expression of someone who had been building toward a question for the past hour, said, "Mr. Calloway, Audrey brought you into this company without board authorization. You accessed restricted systems under a false identity. You constructed fraudulent documentation. Yes, I understand it was for investigative purposes, but I think we all understand that the question of your own role here hasn't been fully addressed." Mason had been waiting for this. "That's fair," he said. "I'll address it." He looked at Hewitt and then at the room, and he said the words he'd spent 8 years not saying in rooms with strangers. He'd served as a Navy SEAL for 14 years. He said it plainly, without embellishment, the way you state a fact that doesn't require decoration. He talked about the nature of that service in the terms he'd used with Pharaoh the night before. Structure rather than specifics, methodology rather than mission names, training rather than operations. He explained what that training produced in practical terms. The ability to enter environments covertly, to assess information systems, to construct intelligence operations, to recognize the architecture of concealment. Everything he'd done inside Langford Defense fell within those capabilities. Nothing he'd done required him to improvise skills he didn't already have. He looked at Hewitt and said, "I didn't come into this company to steal anything. I came in because a woman who needed protection asked for help from the only person in her vicinity who could provide it, and because Vincent Crow demonstrated he was willing to use an 8-year-old child as leverage." He paused. "I'm not asking for a commendation. I'm explaining that the sealed record Crow's attorneys are pointing at as something suspicious is, in fact, evidence that I'm the last person in this situation with a motive to steal defense technology. I spent 14 years protecting it." The room was quiet. Hewitt looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the display. Then he looked at his hands. "The room finally understands," Audrey said, and her voice was very steady. She was looking at Mason when she said it, and there was something in her expression that wasn't gratitude exactly, though it contained gratitude. It was something more complicated, the look of a person who has watched someone they respect do a hard thing and has understood the cost of it. Then Damien Holt's attorney raised his hand. "My client," he said, in the careful syntax of someone reading from a prepared statement that hadn't been written down, "would like to speak." The room turned. Damien looked at his attorney first, something private moving across his face, and then he looked at the table, and then, finally, at Mason. "The server room access started in September of last year," he said. His voice was flat, controlled, a man reciting rather than confessing. "Crow approached me in July. He had documentation, I don't know how he got it, about a financial situation I'd gotten into. He made it clear that cooperation was less costly than the alternative." He paused. "I want to be clear that I didn't know about the school, the child. That wasn't—" He stopped. "I didn't know about that." The room was silent. "I'll cooperate fully with the federal investigation," Damien said. "My attorney will coordinate the documentation." Pharaoh, from his chair along the wall, made a note. Mason watched Damien and felt nothing particular toward him. Not anger, not sympathy, not satisfaction. Damien Holt had made a decision under pressure and then kept making it for 14 months, and the weight of that would be his to carry through whatever came next. That was between him and the law and his own accounting. What Mason felt, looking at the room, was something closer to tired. The specific exhaustion of a sustained effort reaching its conclusion, the way your body finally notices what it's been carrying once the thing is set down. Patricia Wren was already moving. Her associates were gathering documents, coordinating with Pharaoh's team, beginning the procedural machinery that would turn everything in this room into formal legal record. Two of the board members were having a quiet conversation at the far end of the table. The defense contract representatives from D.C. had produced their own phones and were clearly communicating with their office. Audrey walked over to Mason. She stopped beside him and looked at the display, where the Shell Company documentation was still on the screen. "That's everything," she said. "That's everything," he confirmed. She turned to look at him. Up close, in the full light of the conference room, she looked like someone who had been running at capacity for a long time and had just hit the point where the body starts sending bills for it. "How are you?" "I'll be fine," he said, which was true, and also not entirely an answer to the question she'd asked. She seemed to understand that. "I need to speak with the board for the next few hours. Will you?" "I'll be around," he said. He went to a chair near the window and sat and watched the room do what rooms do after the main thing has happened. The secondary conversations, the paperwork, the careful navigation of people who have just been given significant information and are figuring out what it means for them specifically. He drank the coffee that someone had left near his end of the table and watched Fort Worth through the conference room glass, the city going about its ordinary business 11 stories below. At some point, Patricia sat down next to him and said, without preamble, "The investigators are satisfied. They'll want a formal recorded statement from you this week, but Farrow told me this morning he's not anticipating charges." "Okay," Mason said. "That's a good outcome." "I know." She looked at him. "You don't look particularly relieved." "I'm relieved," he said. "It just takes me a while to feel it." She accepted this without comment, which was one of the things he'd come to appreciate about Patricia Wren. She went back to her documents. At 12:30, after the formal portion of the meeting had concluded, and the room had thinned to Audrey and her senior team, and the federal investigators doing a final coordination, Mason's phone buzzed. "Diane, Ellie's asking if you're still doing pizza tonight. She has opinions about toppings." He typed back, "Yes. Tell her I'll be there by 6, and yes to whatever toppings." 3 seconds later, Diane forwarded a voice message. He put in an earbud and played it. Ellie's voice, slightly formal, the way she got when she was leaving messages. "Dad, it's me. So we're thinking pepperoni and the garlic knots for sure. And Cora is here and she says green peppers, but I said no because you don't like green peppers. And this is our pizza. Also, I told Cora about the hamster and the sneaker, and she said she already told me that story and I forgot that she told me. Okay. Bye." He sat in the conference room chair with the city outside the glass and the sound of his daughter's voice in his ear, and felt the exhaustion settle into something else, something quieter and more fundamental, a returning rather than an arriving. He pulled out the earbud and looked at his phone for a moment. Then he put it away. There were still forms to sign, still a statement to give to federal investigators, still the weeks of Crow's legal proceedings stretching out ahead, still the work of rebuilding whatever the past 14 months had damaged in Langford Defense's relationship with its federal contract. But Ellie needed him home by 6, and there was pizza and garlic knots, and apparently the green pepper question still required a final ruling. He looked at the clock. He had time. The pizza was pepperoni. No green peppers. Cora had accepted this outcome with the diplomatic grace of someone who understood she was a guest and would fight this battle another day. Mason sat at his own kitchen table for the first time in what felt like weeks, and ate 3 slices and listened to Ellie and Cora debate whether the school's new library beanbags were better than the old ones, a conversation that had apparently been ongoing for several days and had developed significant nuance. He didn't contribute much. He didn't need to. He just sat there in the noise and warmth of it and let the day slowly drain out of him the way bad days do when something good is patient enough to replace them. Diane picked Cora up at 8. Ellie went through her bedtime routine with the particular thoroughness she applied to things when she could tell her father needed the ordinary pace of ordinary things. Brushing her teeth for the full 2 minutes, putting her clothes in the hamper without being asked, arranging Gerald and the other stuffed animals with a seriousness that suggested each placement carried architectural significance. He sat on the edge of her bed after the light was out. "Dad," she said in the dark. "Yeah." "Is the complicated work stuff done?" He thought about the boardroom. Damian Holt's flat voice saying, September of last year. Farrow's careful notes. Audrey's face when she'd said, "That's everything." "Getting there," he said. "Okay." A pause. "You seem more like yourself today." "What does that mean?" She considered this with the seriousness she brought to questions that required honesty, rather than performance. Like you came back, she said, from wherever you were. He sat with that for a moment. In the dark, with the nighttime sounds of the neighborhood outside her window and the specific quietness that existed only in this room at this hour, it didn't require further unpacking. She'd named it as accurately as it could be named. Yeah, he said. I think I did. She was asleep within 10 minutes. He went to the kitchen and fixed himself a glass of water and stood at the sink looking at the backyard in the dark. The small square of grass he mowed every 2 weeks, the tree that was doing something complicated with its roots, and the fence that he'd been meaning to address for a year, the garage where he kept tools and Ellie's old bike, and 3 boxes he hadn't opened since the move. Ordinary things. His things. He thought about what the next weeks would look like. And for the first time in a while, the thinking didn't feel like preparation for emergency. It felt like planning, which was different. Crow's legal proceedings were moving. Damian Holt's cooperation agreement was signed and documented within 48 hours of the boardroom meeting. His attorneys had, in the end, calculated correctly that full cooperation was the only position that made mathematical sense. And Damian had apparently accepted this with the same controlled flatness he'd brought to everything else. The details he provided to federal investigators confirmed and expanded every element of what Mason had built independently, and added several that Mason hadn't had access to, including the specific name of Crow's intermediary at the Government Contract Oversight Office, who had been flagging Langford's validation failures before they were formally filed. That name generated 2 additional federal investigations, which expanded the circle considerably. Dynacorp Federal Solutions received a formal notice of investigation within 2 weeks of the boardroom meeting. Their CEO made a statement through attorneys that characterized the company's relationship with Meridian Analytical Group as routine consulting work done in good faith, a characterization that federal investigators received with the specific skepticism it warranted. 3 of Dynacorp's senior leadership resigned before the month was out. The Contract Oversight Office placed Langford Defense's federal agreement in a protected status while the investigation proceeded, which meant the contract wasn't canceled, it was shielded. The engineering teams who had been working for 3 years on guidance systems that kept being undermined by information they didn't know was being stolen were told, finally and officially, that the problems they'd been experiencing were not their fault. Mason heard this secondhand from Audrey, who told him one of her senior engineers had cried in the hallway, which was a thing he thought about more than once in the days that followed. Rachel Kim was formally granted immunity from prosecution. The documentation Mason had compiled on her coercion, Crow's leverage over her sister's immigration status, the specific communications in which he'd made his threats, the timeline that established she had acted under duress from the first day, was presented as part of the federal investigation and accepted as sufficient to establish that she was a victim of the operation rather than a participant in it. Vera Cho, the immigration attorney Mason had contacted in Dallas, had been working on Rachel's sister's case in parallel. It was not, as these things never are, a simple or quick resolution. There were hearings and filings and a period of suspended uncertainty that lasted 6 weeks and that Mason checked on periodically, not because it was his responsibility, but because he'd told Rachel he would. The resolution, when it came, was that Rachel's sister received a change of status that gave her a legal pathway forward. Not a perfect outcome, not a story that erased everything that had preceded it, but a door that had been locked and was now open. Rachel called Mason when it came through. She didn't say much. She said, "Thank you." And then, after a pause, I don't have words for—" "You don't need words," he said. "I'm glad it worked out." Another pause. "Did you know it would? When you told me you could help her?" He thought about that honestly. "I thought there was a real path," he said. "I didn't know for certain, but I knew the leverage Crow was using wasn't as airtight as he told you it was. That's how those situations work. They make the trap look bigger than it is, so you stop looking for exits." Rachel was quiet for a moment. "I should have looked harder." "You were protecting someone you love," he said. "That doesn't leave a lot of space for strategic thinking." She left Langford Defense 2 months later. Her choice, not anyone else's. She told Mason in a brief text that she'd accepted a position at a cybersecurity firm in Austin and that she thought the distance would help. He wished her well and meant it. Vincent Crow went to trial in the spring. Mason attended 2 days of it, Not because he was required to be there, his formal federal statement had already been entered into evidence, but because he thought he should see it. He sat in the gallery and watched the proceedings with the same attentiveness he brought to everything and felt, through most of it, a kind of professional detachment. The evidence was presented methodically, the shell company structure, the file transmissions, the access logs. Damian Holt's cooperation testimony, delivered in the same flat-controlled voice he'd used in the boardroom, was thorough and damaging and visibly cost him something he didn't show on his face, but that Mason could see in his hands. Crow sat at the defense table and watched it all with a composure that Mason respected in the dispassionate way you respect a thing without approving of it. He had good attorneys. They made the arguments they could make, the chain of custody issues, the questions about Mason's authorization, the alternative narrative they'd been building since the morning after the arrest. The jury was out for 11 hours. They came back with convictions on all primary counts: corporate espionage, conspiracy to commit fraud against the federal government, unlawful entry and theft of protected documentation, and one count that the prosecutor had added late in the process and that Mason hadn't anticipated: criminal conspiracy to endanger a minor. That last one. The forged documents. The two men in professional dress who had walked into an elementary school with paperwork designed to let them walk out with an 8-year-old girl. The jury had apparently found, in 11 hours of deliberation, that this particular element of Crow's operation was the one that made the clearest possible statement about the kind of man they were looking at. Mason heard the verdicts read and felt something release in his chest that he hadn't fully known was still held there. He went home. He picked Ellie up from school himself, which he'd been doing every day since the fence incident, and which he'd been told by Diane and by Ellie's teacher and by Ellie herself was not strictly necessary anymore, but which he'd continued anyway, because some things take longer than the immediate threat to resolve. "How was your day?" he asked in the car. "Good. We did a project about ecosystems." She looked out the window. "Can I have a snack when we get home?" "Yeah. The good crackers, not the other ones." "I'll see what we have." She turned to look at him. "You're in a good mood." "Am I?" "You're doing the almost smiling thing." He hadn't noticed. "Something good happened today," he said. She waited. "The man who made things difficult," he said carefully. "A court decided he did wrong things, and he has to be accountable for them." Ellie processed this. "The man from the restaurant?" "Yes." She turned back to the window. "Good," she said. It was a complete sentence, not a preamble to anything else. Just good. The uncomplicated verdict of someone who hadn't needed 11 hours. 3 weeks after the trial, Audrey called him on a Tuesday evening. He was in the garage when his phone rang, attempting to determine whether the issue with Ellie's bike was the tire or the brakes or some combination of both, which had become a project of escalating complexity that he'd committed to seeing through. "I want to offer you something," Audrey said, without preamble. "And I want you to actually think about it before you say no." "I'm listening." "Chief Security Officer, Langford Defense. Full restructure of the security division. You design it the way you think it should work. You hire who you want to hire. You build the protocols from the ground up. The Federal Contract Office has actually suggested, through appropriately indirect channels, that having someone with your specific background in a formal leadership position would strengthen their confidence in our security posture." A pause. "The compensation is significant. The role is real. And I'm asking you, not the board, though the board has already approved the idea in principle." He set down the bike wrench. He wiped his hands on his jeans. "Audrey, don't say no yet." "I wasn't going to say no," he said. A silence. "Oh," she said. "I was going to say I have conditions." She laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes unexpectedly, and it sounded like someone who hadn't done it enough recently. "Of course you do," she said. "Name them." "I come home every night," he said. "I don't care what's happening. I don't care what the situation is. Barring an actual act of emergency that requires physical presence, I'm home for dinner. That's non-negotiable." Done. "I won't be a visible security presence. No standing next to you at events, no escort function, nothing that puts me in a position where my face becomes associated with the company publicly. I'll work the way I work best." "I don't want a visible security presence," she said. "I want someone who can prevent the things that require a visible security presence." "Good." He paused. "And I'll need to tell Ellie something real. Not everything, but something real." She's old enough that she knows when I'm managing her understanding of a situation, and she doesn't like it. A pause on the other end. What will you tell her? That I'm going to work for a company that makes important things, and that my job is to make sure nobody messes with it. He picked the wrench back up. She'll probably think that's cool. It is kind of cool, Audrey said. He started on the bike again. I need 2 weeks to sort out the transition from my current position, make the arrangements, set things up properly. 2 weeks is fine. He found the problem with the bike. A brake cable that had frayed at the housing, straightforward fix once you found it. He held the frayed end between his fingers and thought about how many times he'd driven Ellie to school this month, how many evenings he'd watched her ride that bike down the driveway and back. Audrey, he said. Yes. The people in your engineering division, the ones who spent 3 years doing good work and watching it get undermined. I want to talk to their team leads in my first week. Not officially, not a formal meeting, just a conversation. So they know someone is paying attention to what they built. A pause that had something different in it than the others. Warmer. I'll set it up, she said. He accepted the offer. The transition took 10 days instead of 2 weeks, because things always take longer than planned, and Mason had stopped fighting that particular truth somewhere around the time Ellie was 4. He told his plant manager at the industrial firm, a decent man named Gus who had given him work 8 years ago without asking unnecessary questions, that he was moving on, thanked him in the way he tried to thank people who'd done him real good turns, and finished his last week there with the same attention he'd brought to every other week. Gus shook his hand on the last day and said he wasn't surprised, which was the kind of thing that meant more than it appeared to. He told Ellie on a Saturday morning at the kitchen table over the good cereal she'd been angling for. He said he'd been asked to do a job that was a better use of what he was good at, and that it paid more, and that it mattered in a way that was harder to explain, but that he thought she'd understand eventually. She listened with her spoon halfway to her mouth. The company that lady from the restaurant runs, she said. He had not told her this directly. He was briefly reminded that underestimating Ellie was a persistent tactical error. Yes, he said. She ate her cereal. She thought about it. Is she good at running her company? She's getting better at it, he said, which was both accurate and fairer than the simpler answers. Is it dangerous? He looked at his daughter across the table, at her brown eyes that had been deciding whether or not to trust him since she was born, and that had, across 8 years and 1,000 small tests, generally found him worthy of it. Not the way you're thinking, he said. No one's going to be shooting at me. It's mostly sitting in meetings and reading documents and occasionally telling people that what they're planning to do is a bad idea. You're good at the last part, she said. I know. She finished her cereal. She put the bowl in the sink, which she'd started doing without being asked sometime in the past few months. One of those accumulating changes he noticed after the fact. Then she stood in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas and looked at him with the particular expression she used when she was about to say something she'd been building up to. Dad? She said. Yeah. At the restaurant, when you went over to help that lady. She paused. Were you scared? He thought about it honestly. A little, not of the men, just of what it meant, what it might start. She nodded slowly. But you did it anyway. Yep. Because it was right. Because it was right, he confirmed. She thought about this for another moment. And the bad man threatened me to make you stop, and you didn't stop. He looked at her. No, he said. I didn't. Because of me, she said. Not a question. Understanding something. Everything I do is because of you, he said. That's not a burden. That's just the truth. She stood in the doorway for another moment. Then she said, with the decisive practicality that was as much her as anything. Okay. Can we go to the park today? The creek one. Yeah, he said. Go get dressed. She went. He sat at the table with his coffee and the morning coming through the kitchen window and felt the particular quality of quiet that Ellie left behind her. Not empty, never empty, but charged with her presence the way a room stays warm after the heat's been on. He thought about a restaurant, 60 people, a glass breaking against a wall. He thought about a school fence and a phone call that had made his hands go cold. He thought about sitting in the dark of an unfamiliar office waiting for a man to come through a window and take a document that didn't mean what he thought it meant. He thought about 14 years of work in places he still didn't say out loud, and the morning he'd decided to stop, and the specific weight of that decision, and the specific lightness that had followed it. He had believed for a long time that those two things, what he'd been and what he'd become, had to be separate. That the life he was building for Ellie required the other life to stay buried, not because it was shameful, but because the ground that life had stood on was not the same ground as this kitchen, this table, this ordinary morning. That you couldn't be both things without one of them eroding the other. The past 3 weeks had shown him something he hadn't been sure of before. The man who'd sat in a dark server room and waited for Rachel Kim. The man who'd sat at a kitchen table and helped with multiplication. The man who'd stood in a boardroom and dismantled a lie piece by piece. The man who'd carried a sleeping child in from the car and gotten the stuffed animals right. Those weren't different men making awkward peace with each other. They were the same man, doing what the same man did, which was show up and do what was necessary with whatever was available. He'd spent 8 years thinking the seal had to stay buried for the father to survive. What he understood now was simpler and also harder to have figured out alone. The seal hadn't needed burying. He'd needed directing. He'd needed something worth being precise for, something worth being patient for, something that justified all that training in stillness and calculation and the ability to wait longer than the other person could. It turned out fatherhood had been that thing all along. He'd just been too close to it to see clearly. He started going into Langford Defense in early April. He spent his first week doing exactly what he'd told Audrey he wanted to do. Walking the building, meeting people, learning the organization the way he'd always learned environments, slowly, carefully, from the inside out. He sat with the engineering team leads individually, in their offices, and asked them about their work. Not the compromised parts, not the validation failures, the actual work, the systems they were building, and what those systems were designed to do. He listened the way he'd been taught to listen, which was without the intention of responding and with the intention of understanding. He found an organization that was good at what it did and had spent 14 months being told, indirectly and repeatedly, that it wasn't. The damage from that was real and would take time, but it was the kind of damage that responds to straightforward treatment, tell people the truth, give them the tools to do their work, and get out of the way. He started building the security division from the ground up. He hired 3 people in the first month: a former FBI cyber specialist, a physical security analyst from a firm in Houston, and a data forensics examiner who had done federal contract work for years, and who understood, better than most, that the most dangerous compromises were the ones that looked like routine operations. He was a difficult boss in the specific way that competent people are difficult bosses. He expected the same standard from others that he expected from himself, which was high, and he said so directly when it wasn't met, and he said so equally directly when it was. He wrote protocols. He rebuilt the access management structure. He worked with IT to identify and close the vulnerabilities that had allowed the hidden server room to exist undetected for however long it had existed before Mason found it on day 2. He implemented an anomaly detection system that flagged unusual access patterns automatically and routed the flags to 2 people simultaneously, himself and someone in legal, so that no single point of control could suppress an alert. He was, by any measure, good at it. Not in the way that was flashy or visible. In the way that mattered, which was that the problems he was supposed to prevent mostly didn't happen. And when something did happen, it was contained and documented and addressed before it became a crisis. Audrey noticed. She so wisely mostly left him alone, which was the most useful thing a person in her position could do for a person in his. They developed a working relationship that had the particular texture of things built on genuine mutual respect. Not warm in the way that people who socialize together were warm, but solid in the way that things are solid when they've been tested. She told him things she didn't tell her board. He told her things he didn't tell anyone else. They disagreed sometimes, directly and without drama, and usually found the right answer somewhere between their 2 positions. He came home every night. Not perfectly. There were 2 evenings in the first 4 months where something required him to stay later than intended, and both times he called Ellie himself and told her, and both times she said it was fine with the tone of someone who was actually fine rather than performing being fine, which was important to him. He fixed the faucet in the upstairs bathroom in June, which had been leaking for 2 years. He did it on a Saturday morning while Ellie supervised from the doorway and offered observations about his technique that she had no basis for, but delivered with complete confidence. You're doing it wrong, she said. I fixed faucets before. You always say that about everything. Because it's usually true. The garage shelf you fixed fell down, she pointed out. That was a different situation. She watched him for a few more minutes. It's not leaking anymore, she said, with the grudging acknowledgement of someone updating their assessment. No, he said, it's not. She went back to whatever she'd been doing. He cleaned up and put the tools away and stood in the bathroom for a moment looking at the faucet, which was doing nothing interesting, which was the entire point. There was a moment in October, 8 months after the restaurant, 7 months after the boardroom, 3 months into the new job, when he understood that something had settled. Not resolved, because things don't resolve the way stories suggest they do. They just reach a state where the unsettled part becomes small enough that the rest of the structure can hold the weight of it. I was sitting at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening helping Ellie with a history project, and she was asking him questions about something from a period he actually knew well, and he was answering them while also cutting an apple into the pieces she liked. And the television was on in the other room with the sound low, and the neighborhood outside was doing its ordinary evening things. He looked at his daughter across the table, at the project spread between them, at the way she was frowning at her notes with the specific concentration she brought to things that mattered, and thought about nothing in particular. Just looked at her. The way she held her pencil wrong. The way she bit the inside of her cheek. She looked up and caught him looking. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. She studied him for a moment with those eyes that had always seen more than he'd planned for. Then she went back to her notes. "Dad," she said, still writing. "Yeah." "Are you happy?" He thought about it. Not the performance of considering it, actually thought about it the way the question deserved. The kitchen, the faucet that wasn't leaking, the job that used what he was rather than asking him to be something smaller. The fact that he came home every night and that coming home felt like arriving rather than retreating. "Yeah," he said. "I think I am." She nodded, satisfied. "Good," she said, and kept writing. Later, after she was asleep, he stood at the kitchen window and looked at the backyard in the October dark and thought about a crowded restaurant where 60 people had looked away. He thought about what it had cost him to stand up. Not that night, which had cost him almost nothing, but everything that followed, the weeks of sustained exposure, the boardroom, the words he'd had to say about himself to people he didn't know, the 15 years of careful obscurity unwrapped and laid on a conference table under fluorescent light. He thought about whether he'd do it again, knowing what it would cost. It wasn't a difficult question. There's a thing that people who've lived inside institutions of controlled danger understand in a way that's hard to explain to people who haven't, which is that courage is almost never the absence of fear. It's the presence of something that matters more than the fear. The fear is real, and the fear is appropriate, and you feel it completely, and then you set it aside because the other thing is there, and the other thing is larger. What he'd felt at that restaurant wasn't bravery in the heroic sense. It was simpler than that and also more demanding. It was just a man who looked at a situation and looked at what he was capable of and decided that the distance between those two things was something he was responsible for closing. He'd spent years thinking the hardest thing he'd ever done was the work that was sealed in classified records. The missions, the operations, the decisions made in the dark, in places nobody acknowledged afterward. He'd carried that as a kind of private weight and private pride. He knew better now. The hardest thing he'd ever done was come home every night to a little girl who needed him to be present and whole, and there, day after day, in the completely unglamorous work of being someone's person. No training for that, no protocol, no exit strategy, just showing up, imperfectly, across years, and trusting that the cumulative weight of showing up was the most important structure you could build. And when the moment came that required something more, something from the other part of him, the part trained to be precise and patient and capable in the dark, it had been there. Not because he'd maintained it, because it was him. It had always been him. He just needed a reason that was large enough to let him see it clearly. He turned off the kitchen light. He checked the lock. He looked in on Ellie, who was asleep with Gerald in the correct position and the nightlight doing its job, and stood in the doorway for a moment, the way he had stood in doorways for 8 years, doing the accounting that fathers do in the dark when the child can't see them doing it. Everything where it should be. Everything okay. He went to bed. The alarm was set for 5:30. There was lunch to pack in the morning. She'd requested the turkey again, abandoning the ham experiment for the foreseeable future. And he'd bought the good bread this time, the kind she actually liked. There was a field trip form somewhere that probably needed signing. There was a faucet that wasn't leaking and a job that mattered, and a life built out of ordinary things that turned out, on examination, to not be ordinary at all. He closed his eyes. Outside, Fort Worth did what cities do at night, kept going, quietly, full of its own ordinary emergencies and ordinary kindnesses and ordinary people making ordinary decisions that added up, over time, to something that mattered or didn't, depending entirely on which ones they made. Mason Calloway had made his, and every morning, without fail, he made her lunch, and every evening, without fail, he came home. That was enough. That had always been enough. He just had to travel a considerable distance, through years, through a restaurant, through a boardroom, and a dark office, and the sealed record of a life he'd lived before, to understand that what was waiting for him at the end of all of it wasn't a reward. It was just the truth about who he was, and who he had always been.